As the last daylight bled away from the war-shattered skyline of Baghdad, the world seemed to hold its breath. The Mongol siege engines, silent now, had smashed through the city's ancient walls. The acrid scent of smoke and destruction hung dense in the air, choking every breath. Deep below the city, in the frigid underbelly of a hastily fortified Mongol encampment, dozens of Christian captives stood chained inside rough stone dungeons, their feet numb against foul, straw-strewn floors. Torchlight danced against pitted granite, illuminating faces drawn tight with terror and exhaustion. Every metallic rattle of the shackles echoed the prisoners' dread, as if the stones themselves were whispering of their fate. Outside, the soundscape was a discordant ballet, Mongol commanders barking in guttural bursts, horses stamping and neighing restlessly, a new cohort of prisoners being herded inside. For Baghdad's Christian faithful, priests, merchants, women, and children alike, this was the night when centuries of faith and tradition would be tested by unthinkable cruelty. History remembers the Mongol Empire as the most formidable war machine of the 13th century, a colossus stretching from the desolate grasslands of Mongolia to the crowded souks of Baghdad and onward across the frozen steppes towards Europe. Under the iron rule of the Khans, faiths and flags rose and fell in a cycle at once brutally simple and fiendishly complex. In the year 1241, the Mongols struck Poland. By 1251, Mungka Khan ruled all from the Pacific to the Carpathians. Religious tolerance was preached, but in practice, faith often became a battleground for power, and the Christians of the Middle East found themselves caught squarely in the gears. Batu Khan, one of Genghis' most feared descendants, had swept across the Western-occupied territories with a determination known to unmake both cities and souls. A chilling Ottoman ledger discovered in 1923 details the cost of iron shackles and food rations for prisoners. The numbers are staggering. Each month, more than 200 Christians were recorded as provisioned for transfer, which, as later found in skeletal records beneath Samarkand, translated into forced marches, deadly starvation, and death en route or in captivity. Father Elias, a Nestorian Christian priest from the city of Tikrit, became a quiet leader among the captives. His beard was streaked with gray, his posture stooped by age and hunger. Yet his eyes betrayed neither weakness nor surrender. Joining him was Maria, a young Armenian woman who stood tall in the face of predatory Mongol guards, refusing to betray even a flicker of fear despite being only 19. At the heart of their struggle was a conflict far older than Baghdad itself. The Mongols saw religious difference as both a threat and an opportunity, a lever to manipulate, exploit, or crush at whim. Their reputation for brutality was forged by both necessity and calculation. To submit meant a short, uncertain reprieve. To resist was to risk extermination. For the Christian prisoners, the core question each day was chillingly simple. Survive and perhaps see hope rekindled, or perish, your faith erased from the world and memory. If we yield our spirit now, Father Elias whispered to Maria as the dungeon quieted after midnight, we betray not only ourselves, but all who came before. God forgive us not our sins, but our silence. His words landed in the dark like tiny flames, each prisoner clutching them as if for warmth. The stakes were clear. What happened in these Mongol dungeons would not only decide their fates, but might also shift the tides of faith and power across Eurasia for centuries to come. If you're drawn to raw, documented records and buried histories of faith, power, and survival, don't forget to subscribe to Epoch Ensemble. It's your support that helps us uncover long-lost accounts hidden in forgotten ruins and ancient archives. Now, back to the story. The initial shock of capture did not kill hope, at least not immediately. In those first numb hours, as prisoners found themselves herded into damp cells, there were murmured prayers for deliverance, a near silence pierced by sobs and the grinding of metal on stone. Overhead, torch smoke clung to the low-vaulted ceilings, burning their throats. Mongol guards paced the corridor, their boots caked in mud and blood. One, a hulking young warrior named Sorgan, dragged a wooden bucket filled with stale water and moldy crusts down the aisle. He paused at Maria's cell, eyes narrowed. You, Armenian, still believe your God will help? His taunt hung in the dust-choked air. Even he bows to the great Khan. But faith, for some, burned quiet and stubborn. Maria did not look away. In that brief flash, her resistance found an ember in the room. Others took courage, if only enough to survive another hour. Survival, however, had its price. Ottoman ledgers note that by the first month alone, half of all new Christian prisoners died of disease or starvation. Records later corroborated by Vatican letters and the 1926 excavation of mass graves just west of Baghdad's walls. The odors inside the jail became overpowering, ammonia and rot, seeping wounds and rancid bread. Food, when it came, was tossed through the iron bars with mockery or a violent flourish. Maria watched Father Elias breaking a crust in half, passing the smaller piece to a child whose lips were blue with cold. The Mongols sometimes offered meat, unblessed and rumors said from unclean sources. To refuse was to starve, but to accept was to court spiritual damnation. "They feed us hate," one prisoner murmured, "and call it mercy." Somewhere above ground, the winds of empire were shifting. The Mongols, initially curious about Christianity, especially the ancient Nestorian churches, began to view their Christian subjects with suspicion. Batu Khan, having once welcomed Christian advisors at court, now saw religious difference as potential treason, citing intercepted letters between Armenian princes and the Vatican. In a Vatican report dated 1262, a secret papal envoy describes in alarming detail the long rows of Christian prisoners whose bones protrude through gray skin, their eyes dry with dread but unclouded in spirit. It was only the beginning. That year, the Khan's patience splintered. A new order decreed no rites, no prayers under penalty of the sword. Even whispered prayer became an act of subversion. The prison descended into greater horror as Mongol priests, converted shamans wielding their own blend of terror and spiritual authority, forced the captives to renounce their faith, to spit on carved crosses and convert under pain of torture. The punishment for refusal was public. A man stripped bare, whipped with leather cords until flesh hung in ribbons. A young deacon forced to walk blindfolded across hot coals, guided only by the insults of guards. To yield would mean partial relief, a bowl of millet, a visit to the sick ward, but each would carry scars, both physical and spiritual. Maria's resolve was tested when Sorgan returned, offering her clean water in exchange for just one word of blasphemy. "The great Khan rewards those who bend," he crooned. She met his gaze, quiet but unbroken. "We do not bargain away our souls." Yet, out of despair grew the first stirrings of resistance. In a battered corner of the dungeon, Father Elias scraped with a tiny sliver of iron until he exposed a half-broken brick, behind which he concealed a thin strip of parchment salvaged from discarded prison waste. By guttering candle, he wrote prayers and names of the living and lost, a forbidden record of faith maintained at mortal risk. Maria and a few women managed to pass messages between cells using bits of thread and folded straw. The guards, their curiosity piqued by increasing murmurs, intensified searches, flinging open cells in violent fury and punishing even the faintest suspicion. In 1264, a catastrophe unfolded. The death of a Mongol prince, attributed by shamans to a Christian prisoner's curse, triggered a massacre. Bar Hebraeus, the famed Jacobite chronicler, wrote, "The Christians of Baghdad fell as wheat beneath the scythe. The stench lingered as long as memory. Prisoners were dragged out by the dozens, chained together at the wrists and herded like cattle towards the river. There, before a jeering crowd, Mongol executioners sent them one by one into the muddy waters, arrows darkening the sky. Some, too weak to stand, simply slid under the surface. The rest knelt, hands intertwined, singing the Lord's Prayer as the arrow storms fell. Bones recovered by archaeologists in 1947, bearing clear signs of arrow punctures and binding, confirm the reports. By nightfall, Father Elias noticed a subtle shift among the survivors. Not just fear, but a determined unity. Gone were the broken murmurs of surrender. Instead, conspiratorial whispers spread, of tunnels, of sabotage, even of poisoning Mongol food stores. The authorities, spurred by their own spies, struck back. At dawn, screaming Mongols swept through the cells, beating and dragging prisoners towards public pyres. But records from an Ottoman administrator, Yusuf al-Khalid, state, no evidence could silence their songs, nor flesh their faith. Maria's hardship was compounded by her gender. Mongol rulers and guards viewed young women as commodities, reserving special cruelties for those who refused conversion. With steely resolve, she intervened when her friend, a girl named Anahid, was targeted by guards. Maria's bold defiance, standing between Anahid and a sword, became an act of legend, recounted in regional church song for generations. Over time, she organized makeshift care for the sick, distributing whatever could be pilfered from the guards' rations and using torn robe scraps as bandages. Clandestine hymns ring out through the darkness, sometimes drowned by a guard's shout, sometimes swelling into choral defiance. The Mongol authorities, their patience fraying, once again shifted tactics. Batu Khan, eager to cement his power and appease newly converted Muslim advisors, decreed the final purge. No prisoners were to survive the winter. In 1271, records show the average price for an iron shackle dropped, reflecting a glut of prisoner deaths. Orders came down. The dungeons were to be purged. At the appointed hour, fires were ignited at both ends of the prison tunnels. Inside, the heat became unbearable, the air thick with burning straw and flesh. Metal expanded and snapped. Voices rose higher, until nothing but the roar of flames and the sound of collapsing stone remained. A few, however, escaped into legend. Oral traditions in Armenia and Georgia still speak of a disappearing band of Christian survivors who tunneled beneath the walls and vanished into the wilderness, eventually seeking refuge in distant monasteries or mountain caves. One fragmentary letter, discovered sealed in a jar near Mutsketa in 1889, records a single desperate plea: "We are scattered, but we remember. The world must remember." Generations later, the Vatican received stories of these survivors. Clerics clung to tales of reluctant Mongol tolerance after envoys from the west. John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, chief among them, secured brief reprieves through negotiation and gifts. Their missions, as preserved in papal correspondence, achieved little lasting security, but for a precious handful of months, Christian captives were permitted to worship in peace, their crosses displayed openly for the last time beneath Mongol banners. But the wheel of empire crushed hope with relentless certainty. By the final decades of the 13th century, the Mongol elite chose Islam over Christianity. This shift was swift and absolute. Churches across Central Asia were burned, their stones repurposed, their frescoes destroyed. In Samarkand, scorched remains and charred wooden crosses were found in a ruined crypt, excavated in 1978. Nestorian and Armenian priests, those fortunate or wary enough to flee, left, scattering their flocks in memory across the vastness of Eurasia. The crimes and horrors perpetrated against Christian prisoners were slowly erased from official record as Islamic chroniclers rose in favor. The Vatican, its own ambitions checked, gradually ceased advocacy for prisoners of the steppes. But evidence could not be buried forever. In the 20th century, mass graves unearthed near Baghdad and skeletal analysis revealed telltale trauma. Iron shackle scoring, deliberate bone breakage, arrow wounds. Parchment fragments recovered in sealed jars echo the tales, while Ottoman, Vatican, and local Armenian sources, once hidden in private archives, corroborate what chroniclers like Bar Hebraeus had always insisted. The Christian presence in Mongol-ruled Asia was nearly obliterated, its legacy only faintly traced in regional folktales and the secret symbols chiseled on remote monastery walls. Why does this buried truth matter? The fate of these prisoners was not merely a tragedy, it was a pivotal turning point in Eurasian religious history. The stronghold of Eastern Christianity across Old Silk Road roots fractured. Muslim, Mongol, and later Turkic expansion became unimpeded by counterweights, shifting trade, diplomacy, and even the fate of Europe's great cities. Later persecutions across the continent echoed these same patterns: forced conversions, cultural erasure, silence as a weapon. Local memory did not forget. In remote Armenian villages, descendants still whisper the story of Maria's stand. In the mountains of Georgia, old crosses carved into hidden caves bear silent witness. Local tales describe how the sky screamed when the Mongols burned the last church, tying natural disasters to the erasure of Christian faith. Even centuries later, these whispered traditions find new life, a testament that the world may try to forget, but humanity's need to remember is fierce and unyielding. Modern historians, reviewing forensic and documentary evidence, now see the Mongol religious policy not as a single wave of brutality, but as a series of calculated, shifting moves, alliances forged and broken, faith tolerated, then eradicated, always to serve the needs of empire. Nestorian Christianity, once so widespread in the East that it rivaled Rome, became a shadow, a ghost moving across caravans and hidden monasteries, nearly forgotten but not entirely erased. And why have so many textbooks fallen silent on this epoch? In part, it disturbs a convenient narrative, forcing a reckoning with the slow violence of erasure and the resilience of faith faced with overwhelming power. In the end, what can we learn from the fate of these prisoners? Perhaps that endurance is not always rewarded, that silence, chosen or enforced, is a second death. Yet even in suffering, in the last handshake between Father Elias and Maria, in the echo of forbidden prayers whispered in darkness, there remained a vital pulse of resistance. Their words did not end in those tombs. In our silence, wrote Father Elias in his final, smuggled note, we still speak. You who find these words, remember us, and let your own silence be broken. Centuries later, we at Epoch Ensemble strive to answer that call. In the shadows of empire, countless voices were silenced, yet their faith and defiance endured through the ages. In their silence, they still speak, through bones, documents, and whispered tales. Tell us in the comments what struck you most about this chapter lost to the dust of time. Which forgotten figures or stories from history should we uncover and resurrect next? For more buried truths and dark history unraveled, subscribe now and join us on this journey. And when the world's noise falls silent, remember, sometimes the shadows of history are the only voices daring enough to light our way.